For years, one of the most famous women in the world told the same heartbreaking lie about herself. When reporters and fans asked Marilyn Monroe about her family, she would say with those wide, sad eyes that she was essentially an orphan, that she had never really known her mother, that she had grown up bouncing between foster homes, unwanted and alone, a poor little abandoned girl who had clawed her way to stardom with no one behind her. It became part of the Marilyn Monroe legend, the tragic waif who made good, the orphan who became a goddess. But it was not true. Or at least, it was not the whole truth. Because Marilyn Monroe's mother was alive for almost the entirety of her daughter's life. She outlived her famous daughter by more than 2 decades. And the reason Marilyn so often pretended otherwise was not cruelty, and it was not simply publicity. It was something far sadder and far more complicated. Her mother, a woman named Gladys Baker, spent most of her adult life confined in psychiatric institutions, lost inside a mind unraveled by paranoid schizophrenia, unable to raise her own child, unable, at times, even to recognize the world around her. The story of Gladys Baker is one of the most tragic and least understood chapters in the entire Marilyn Monroe saga. It is a story of mental illness passed down through generations, of a woman who tried and failed, again and again, to hold on to the daughter she loved, and of a bond between a mother and child that was never quite severed and never quite whole. To truly understand Marilyn Monroe, the fragility beneath the glamour, the loneliness beneath the fame, the terror that haunted her all her life, you have to understand the woman who gave birth to her. This is the tragic story of Gladys Baker and her daughter. And it begins, as so many family tragedies do, generations before Marilyn was ever born. A family haunted by darkness. To understand Gladys Baker, you first have to understand the family she came from, because the darkness that would eventually consume her did not begin with her. It ran like a black thread through the generations that came before. Gladys Pearl Monroe was born in May of 1902, in a town in Mexico just across the border from Texas, where her American family was temporarily living. Her parents were not wealthy. Her father worked as a house painter, her family drifting from place to place. And from the very beginning, the household was shadowed by instability and, more ominously, by mental illness. Because Gladys's own father, Otis, was a deeply troubled man. He suffered from terrible headaches, from seizures, from rages and crying fits, and a slow, frightening deterioration of his mind. He drank heavily, and eventually his condition was given a name, a severe neurological illness that was, by the time it was diagnosed, far too advanced to treat. He died in a mental institution in 1909 when Gladys was just a small child. That was the first tragedy. But it was not the last. Because mental illness, in that era poorly understood and impossible to treat, seemed to stalk the Monroe family relentlessly. Gladys's mother, Della, was herself an unstable and volatile figure, marrying and divorcing repeatedly, moving from man to man, exposing her children to chaos and unhappiness. And Della, too, would eventually be committed to a mental institution, where she would die not long after. Even further back, there were other relatives touched by the same shadow, and later in the family's story, a grandfather would take his own life. This was the genetic and emotional inheritance that Gladys was born into. A family in which madness and despair seemed to arrive in every generation like an unwelcome recurring guest. It is worth pausing to consider what it means to be born into a family like that, because it is central to everything that follows. Gladys did not choose her inheritance any more than her daughter would later choose hers. She was handed at birth a genetic predisposition to serious mental illness, and then raised in an environment of instability and trauma, almost perfectly designed to bring that predisposition to the surface. We now understand that severe mental illness often runs in families, shaped by both biology and environment, by the genes we carry and the childhoods we endure. Gladys had the worst of both. Her body carried the vulnerability, and her chaotic upbringing supplied the stress and instability that so often trigger it. In a real sense, she never had a fair chance. The dice had been loaded against her before she was old enough to understand the game. Growing up amid all of that, Gladys had a difficult and lonely childhood. She was, by accounts, a pretty and lively girl, but she was also marked by the instability around her. moving from home to home with a mother who could not provide security. And like so many young women in her circumstances and her era, she reached for the only escape that seemed available. She married young, terribly young. At just 14 years old, Gladys married a man named Jasper Baker, who was significantly older than she was. It was, in a sense, an attempt to flee one unhappy household for the promise of another, more stable one. It did not work. The marriage was, by most accounts, an unhappy and even abusive one. Gladys had 2 children with Jasper Baker, a son and a daughter, while she was still barely more than a child herself. And when that marriage collapsed in divorce, something happened that would prefigure the greatest heartbreak of Gladys's life. Her former husband took their 2 young children away from her, moving them across the country, effectively removing them from her life. Gladys lost her first 2 children. This was a wound that never healed. A mother separated from her babies, and it would echo years later in the way she lost her 3rd child too. Because that 3rd child, born years afterward to a different set of circumstances, would grow up to become Marilyn Monroe, the birth of Norma Jean. By the mid-1920s, Gladys had made her way to Los Angeles and found work in the booming new motion picture industry. Employed as a film cutter, a negative cutter, splicing together strips of film in the editing rooms of Hollywood studios. It was steady, skilled work, and for a time Gladys seemed to be building something like a stable life. She was young, attractive, sociable, and moving in the orbit of the movie business, the very world her daughter would one day conquer. But her personal life remained turbulent. Gladys's 2nd marriage, to a man named Mortensen, had already fallen apart. And in June of 1926, Gladys gave birth to her 3rd child, a daughter, whom she named Norma Jean. The identity of Norma Jean's biological father has been debated for a century and never definitively settled, one of the many uncertainties that would shadow Marilyn Monroe's sense of who she was. On the birth certificate, the baby was given the surname of Gladys's estranged husband, but the truth of her parentage remained murky. Norma Jean came into the world already, in a sense, uncertain of her own origins. And here is the first heartbreaking fact of Marilyn Monroe's life. Her mother, Gladys, was in no position to raise her. Whether because of her precarious finances, her demanding work schedule, or the mental fragility that was already beginning to show, Gladys made the decision, when Norma Jean was still an infant, just days or weeks old, to place her baby with a foster family. Norma Jean spent her earliest years living with a foster couple, seeing her mother only on occasional visits, on weekends when Gladys would come to spend time with the daughter she could not keep. It is important to be fair to Gladys here, because it would be easy to judge her harshly. This was a single mother in the 1920s, working a demanding job, with essentially no support system and a family history of instability, and she was placing her child in what she hoped was a safe, stable home. In her own way, she was trying. Those weekend visits mattered to her. There are photographs of Gladys with the toddler, Norma Jean, at the beach, in the sun, a young mother and her little girl, and in them you can see the affection was real. Gladys loved her daughter. She simply could not, for reasons partly of circumstance and partly of a mind that was beginning to betray her, provide the stable home that daughter so desperately needed. And even in these early years, the warning signs of what was coming had begun to appear. There was a chilling incident when Norma Jean was very small. During one of her visits, Gladys, in a state of distress, reportedly tried to take the child away from the foster home by force, attempting essentially to abscond with her own daughter before being stopped. It was an early flash of the instability, the desperation, and the loosening grip on reality that would soon overwhelm her entirely. Gladys wanted her daughter. She loved her daughter, but the darkness that had claimed her father and would claim so much of her family was already closing in. And within a few years, it would take her completely. The breakdown. For a brief, hopeful period in the early 1930s, it looked as though Gladys might be able to build a real life with her daughter after all. When Norma Jean was around 7 years old, Gladys, having saved money and seeming more stable, actually reclaimed her. She bought a house or took on the mortgage of one and brought Norma Jean to live with her. for what may have been the only real stretch of genuine mother and daughter home life the two of them ever shared. For a moment, Gladys was doing exactly what she had always wanted to do. She was being a mother, but it did not last, and the way it fell apart was catastrophic. In 1933 and 1934, a series of blows fell on Gladys in rapid succession, and her fragile mind could not withstand them. She learned that her son from her first marriage, the boy who had been taken from her years before, had died of an illness while still just a teenager. It was a devastating loss, the death of one of the children she had already lost once to divorce, now lost forever. Around the same time, her grandfather died by suicide, another dark note from the family's haunted history. And on top of all this personal grief came financial and professional stress, pressures piling up on a woman whose grip on reality was already tenuous. It was too much. In 1934, Gladys Baker suffered a complete mental breakdown. She became severely depressed, unable to sleep, unable to cope. And then she became manic and agitated in ways that those around her could not manage. There is an account that on one terrible day she became so distressed and out of control that the friends caring for her could not calm her, and the situation grew so alarming that authorities eventually had to be called, and Gladys was taken away, physically removed from her home, to begin what would become a lifetime of confinement. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, the same broad category of severe mental illness that had, in various forms, haunted her family for generations. Doctors declared her unable to care for herself, let alone for a child. And with that, little Norma Jean, just 8 years old, lost her mother. Imagine that moment from the child's point of view, because it is almost unbearable to contemplate. A little girl, only recently reunited with the mother she had spent years longing for, finally living in a real home with her, and then watching that mother come apart, watching her become someone frightening and unrecognizable, and finally watching her be taken away by strangers, carried off to a place the child could not follow and could barely comprehend. There would have been no way to explain it to an 8-year-old in terms she could understand. Her mother was simply there one day and gone the next, and the home they had briefly shared dissolved, and the little girl was sent back out into the world of other people's houses. That kind of loss, sudden and total and impossible to make sense of, leaves a mark that never fully fades. Not to death, but to something in some ways harder to understand. Her mother was still alive, but she was gone, vanished into the world of state hospitals and psychiatric wards, into a mind that could no longer function in the ordinary world. For a child, this is an almost incomprehensible kind of loss. A mother who exists and yet is unreachable, present in the world but absent from your life, taken not by an accident or an illness you can name simply, but by something invisible and frightening and impossible to explain to a little girl. And so began the childhood that the world would later hear about, the foster homes, the orphanage, the shuffling from household to household. Because with Gladys committed, Norma Jean became a ward of the state. Her mother's friend, a woman named Grace, took on legal responsibility for her, but Norma Jean's life became one of profound instability, passed among foster families, spending time in an orphanage, never certain where she belonged or who would keep her. The lie Marilyn would later tell, that she was an orphan, was not really a lie at all in the emotional sense. She had a living mother, but for all practical purposes, she had been orphaned by mental illness. Her mother was locked away, and the little girl was left to fend for herself in a world that had no permanent place for her. A mother behind walls. For the rest of her long life, Gladys Baker would spend the majority of her years inside institutions. From that first breakdown in 1934, through decades that followed, she moved between state hospitals, psychiatric facilities, and periods of supervised care, her illness ebbing and flowing but never truly releasing her. She was, for most of the 20th century, one of the countless forgotten people warehoused in the mental institutions of that era. An age when the treatment of severe mental illness was crude, often cruel, and rarely effective. Her condition expressed itself in the classic and heartbreaking patterns of paranoid schizophrenia. She suffered from delusions and paranoia. In her later years, gripped by her illness, she became convinced that the doctors and staff at the facility where she lived were trying to poison her, secretly contaminating her food. She wrote desperate letters pleading to be released, insisting that if she were not let out soon, she would surely die from the poison she believed was being fed to her. This was the daily reality of her existence, a mind turned against the world, seeing threats and conspiracies everywhere, unable to trust even the people caring for her. Gladys had also, at some point, become a devout adherent of Christian Science, a faith that emphasizes spiritual healing and is often skeptical of conventional medicine. And this became tangled up tragically with her illness, because Gladys came to refuse the medications prescribed to help manage her schizophrenia, believing that they conflicted with her religious teachings, that what she needed was not medicine but prayer. It is one of the most poignant aspects of her story, a woman desperately ill, offered what limited help the era could provide, and turning it away in favor of a faith she clung to as her mind crumbled. She believed prayer would save her. The medicine sat untaken, and the illness kept its grip. There were flashes, throughout these years, of the desperate desire for freedom that never left her. In one remarkable episode, later in her life, Gladys actually escaped from the institution where she was being held. She climbed out through a small window and lowered herself to the ground using a rope she had fashioned by tying together uniforms. She made her way, on foot, some 15 miles, before being found the next day inside a church, where she told police she had run away in order to practice her Christian Science faith. She was deemed not to be a danger, and returned to the institution. It is a strange and almost heroic image. This frail, mentally ill woman engineering her own escape with a rope of knotted uniforms, driven by a longing to be free and to worship as she believed she should. It captures something essential about Gladys, that beneath the illness there was still a person in there, still wanting, still striving, still herself in some fundamental way that the schizophrenia could never entirely erase. But for the most part, Gladys lived behind walls, in a kind of exile from the ordinary world. While out in that world, something extraordinary was happening. Her daughter, the little girl she had lost, was becoming the most famous woman on the planet. The daughter's shame and the daughter's love. As Norma Jean transformed herself into Marilyn Monroe, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, the existence of her institutionalized mother became a complicated and painful secret. And this is where we return to that lie. The story Marilyn told about being an orphan. It is easy, at first glance, to see this as a cruel thing. A famous daughter denying her own mother, pretending she was dead or had never existed. But the truth is far more human and far more sympathetic. In the 1940s and 1950s, mental illness carried an enormous, crushing stigma. Schizophrenia was not spoken of. To have a parent in a mental institution was a source of deep shame, something families hid at all costs. And for Marilyn, there was an additional, terrible fear layered on top of that shame, a fear that would haunt her all her life. Given her family history, given that mental illness had claimed her mother, her grandmother, her grandfather, and more, Marilyn was terrified that she too would one day lose her mind. She lived in dread of inheriting the family curse. Talking openly about her mother's schizophrenia meant confronting that terror publicly, and it meant inviting the world to wonder whether the glamorous star might be next. So Marilyn hid it. She told the orphan story partly to protect herself, partly because the studio system encouraged a simpler, more sympathetic narrative, and partly, one suspects, because the real story was simply too painful to tell. But here is the crucial thing, the thing that redeems Marilyn in this story. Privately, she did not abandon her mother. Not at all. In 1952, a gossip columnist discovered the truth, that Marilyn Monroe's mother was not dead, but alive and living in a care facility outside Los Angeles. The secret was out, and rather than continue to deny it entirely, Marilyn was forced to acknowledge her mother's existence, issuing a careful statement admitting that her mother was alive, but explaining that they had long been estranged, that she had barely known her, that her mother was unwell and living in care. It was a delicate, painful piece of damage control, an attempt to tell just enough of the truth to survive the revelation without exposing the full depth of the family's tragedy. But what the public did not fully appreciate was how much Marilyn had already been quietly doing. Despite the estrangement, Despite the fact that her mother had been absent for virtually her entire life, despite her own fear and shame, Marilyn Monroe supported her mother financially. She sent Gladys a monthly allowance. She arranged and paid for her care. She maintained a connection, however strained and difficult, with the woman who had given birth to her. This was not a daughter who had coldly discarded her mother. This was a daughter carrying an almost impossibly complicated burden, a mother she barely knew, who had never been able to care for her, who was lost inside a frightening illness, and yet whom she still felt bound to, still loved in some deep and wounded way, and still took responsibility for. Marilyn visited her mother over the years, though the visits were difficult. Gladys, in the grip of her illness, was not an easy person to connect with. She could be distant, paranoid, caught up in her religious convictions and her delusions. The warm, healing mother-daughter reconciliation that Marilyn surely longed for was never really possible. The illness stood between them like a wall of glass. Marilyn could see her mother, could reach toward her, but could never quite touch her. There is a detail from what may have been their final meeting, in the summer of 1962, just weeks before Marilyn's own death, that captures the whole tragic relationship. Marilyn, worried about her mother, urged Gladys to take her prescribed medication, and Gladys, still refusing, still convinced that prayer was all she needed, declined. But before her daughter left, Gladys said something simple and tender. She told Norma Jean that she was a good girl. In that small moment, beneath all the illness and all the years of separation, there was still a mother recognizing her child, still a flicker of the love that had never entirely died. It was, perhaps, as close to a reconciliation as the two of them would ever get. The shared shadow. To understand why Gladys Baker's story matters so much, you have to understand how deeply her illness and the family history behind it shaped the daughter who became a legend. Because Marilyn Monroe did not just lose her mother to mental illness. She lived her entire life under the shadow of the fear that she would share her mother's fate. This fear was not irrational. Marilyn came from a family in which severe mental illness had appeared in generation after generation. Her great-grandfather, her grandfather, her grandmother, her mother, all touched by madness or instability or suicide. Marilyn knew this history, and she was terrified by it. And as her own life went on, as she struggled with depression, with crippling anxiety, with insomnia, with an escalating dependence on pills and alcohol, with emotional volatility that those around her found increasingly difficult to manage, that terror only deepened. Those closest to her began to see, or believed they saw, echoes of Gladys in Marilyn's behavior, the erratic moods, the paranoia that would sometimes surface, the sense of a fragile mind under enormous strain. Marilyn was never formally diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it would be irresponsible to claim she had her mother's specific illness. But she clearly battled serious mental health challenges throughout her life, and she clearly believed, with real dread, that the family curse might be coming for her. She reportedly told people she was afraid of ending up like her mother, locked away, lost to her own mind. It was one of the deepest fears of her life. And when you understand that, so much about Marilyn Monroe comes into sharper focus. The desperate need for love and reassurance, the instability in her relationships, the reliance on substances to quiet a mind that would not rest, the sense, beneath all the dazzling glamour, of a person clinging to the edge of something dark and terrifying. Marilyn was, in a very real sense, running from her mother's fate her entire life. And there is a bitter, tragic irony in how it all ended. Marilyn Monroe died in August of 1962, at just 36 years old, of a barbiturate overdose. Her mother, the woman she had feared becoming, the woman locked away in an institution, outlived her. Gladys Baker was still alive when her famous daughter died. The daughter who had spent her life terrified of her mother's fate did not, in the end, succumb to madness in an institution. She died young, of the pills and the pain, while her mother lived on. It was as though the family darkness, having been outrun for so long, finally caught the daughter in a different form entirely. The final years, and the inheritance of love. When Marilyn Monroe died, she did not forget her mother, even in death. In her will, Marilyn made provisions for Gladys's continued care, setting aside money to ensure that her mother would be looked after for the rest of her life, an income drawn from a trust to provide for the woman who could not provide for herself. It was a final act of that complicated, wounded love, a daughter reaching out one last time to protect the mother who had never been able to protect her. Even from beyond the grave, Marilyn was still taking care of Gladys. Gladys, for her part, is said to have received the news of her daughter's death with the strange, flattened detachment that her illness so often produced. By some accounts, she showed little visible reaction, whether because the schizophrenia had blunted her capacity to process such a loss, or because the mother and daughter had been separated for so long that the bond had become abstract, or simply because grief expresses itself in unknowable ways in a mind so profoundly ill. It is one of the saddest notes in the whole story. A mother unable, perhaps, even to fully grieve the death of her own world-famous child. Gladys lived on for more than 2 decades after Marilyn's death. In her later years, she was eventually released from institutional care and went to live for a time with her other surviving daughter, Marilyn's half-sister, Bernice, the daughter from that first marriage who had been taken away all those years before but who had, remarkably, reconnected with the family in adulthood. It is a small mercy in a bleak story that Gladys, at the very end, had one of her lost daughters back in her life. Eventually, she moved to a retirement home in Florida. Gladys Pearl Baker died in March of 1984, at the age of 81, of heart failure. She had outlived her famous daughter by nearly 22 years. She had spent roughly half a century, off and on, confined by mental illness. She had lost, in one way or another, all 3 of the children she bore, 2 to a vengeful ex-husband, and the 3rd to death and fame, and finally to that overdose. She had been the mother of the most famous woman in the world, and she had lived and died in obscurity, a footnote to a legend, remembered, when she was remembered at all, only as the mad mother of Marilyn Monroe, what her story leaves behind. So who was Marilyn Monroe's mother? She was not the monster that some sensationalized accounts have made her out to be, nor the simple villain of a tragic star's origin story. Gladys Pearl Baker was a deeply ill woman, born into a family soaked in mental illness and instability, who never had a real chance at the ordinary happiness most people take for granted. She was a woman who lost her first 2 children to divorce, who tried and failed to raise her 3rd, whose mind betrayed her before she was even middle-aged, and who spent the bulk of her long life locked away from the world, tormented by delusions, refusing the medicine that might have helped, clinging to prayer, and to the fragments of herself that the illness had not yet taken. And she was a mother who loved her daughter, in the only broken way she was able to. The affection in those early beach photographs was real. The desperate, failed attempt to reclaim her little girl was born of love. The recognition in that final meeting when she called Norma Jean a good girl was real. Gladys Baker was not incapable of love. She was incapable, tragically, of everything else. Of stability, of health, of the ability to be present, of the basic functioning that being a mother requires. And so her love, real as it was, could never reach her daughter in the way either of them needed. The greatest tragedy of Gladys Baker's story is that it did not stay contained to her. It reached forward, into the life of the daughter she could not raise, shaping Marilyn Monroe in ways that would ultimately contribute to her own early death. The instability of that childhood, the abandonment, the shame, the terror of inherited madness, all of it flowed directly from Gladys's illness and the family history behind it. Marilyn's whole life, in a sense, was an attempt to escape the gravity of her mother's fate, and though she escaped the institution, she could not escape the pain. The 2 women, so separated in life, so unable to reach one another across the wall of Gladys's illness, were bound together by something deeper than the circumstances that kept them apart. They shared the same wound, they shared the same shadow, and perhaps that is the most important thing Gladys Baker's story teaches us. It is a story about mental illness, yes, but more than that, it is a story about how the pain of one generation can flow into the next, about how a mother's suffering can shape a daughter's entire life, even a daughter she was never able to raise. It is a reminder that behind the most dazzling icon of glamour the 20th century ever produced, there was a frightened girl who had lost her mother to a darkness she feared would one day come for her too. And it is a reminder to have compassion for the ill, for the suffering, for the people locked away and forgotten, because every one of them, even the mad mother of Marilyn Monroe, was once someone's child, and was, beneath the illness, a full human being who deserved to be understood. The subjects of mental illness and loss touched on in this story are serious ones, and if you or someone you know is struggling, please know that understanding and support are available, and that reaching out is always worth it. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more of these fascinating and human stories.